Hello, Paul.
Hi.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. We are super excited for today's conversation. And today we are really fortunate to have Mr. Paul Greenwood joining us. Paul is an amazing advocate and has spoken for our 40-hour training as well. And we're really excited that you're able to join us. So Paul began his work for 13 years as a lawyer in England, but then relocated here to San Diego and has dedicated 20 years really as head of the Elder Abuse Prosecution Unit at the DA's office in San Diego. He has since retired. He retired in 2018, but that hasn't stopped the amazing work that he is doing. He continues to provide education surrounding elder abuse and how we can continue helping our senior population. And he, as I mentioned, has even been a huge advocate for us in providing this education to all of us. So we're really excited to have you join us and just going over some logistics here. You do have a chat available on here. So if you have any questions, we'll probably save the Q&A for the end. We'll address your questions. So if you have any questions, please type those out in the chat box and we'll receive those. And so you can send it to all panelists, which is on here. This would go to Laura's house and to Paul Greenwood, or it could be to all panelists and attendees, and that would be shared with everyone on here. So you get to decide how you want to ask those questions. So we have some folks here joining us, and we also are live on Facebook. So just being aware of that, but you can't see any of your faces. You can only see ours, and you'll see another Laura's House account and Paul Greenwood's screen. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, but we'll start off the questions. We'll kind of do this as a Q&A format. If you haven't joined us before, that's how we start off our discussion here, but then we'll leave it off to open Q&A for everyone else. So we'll start off. Paul, thank you again for joining us. Can you provide us with an overview of the dynamics of elder abuse?
Sure. And first of all, thank you to Laura's House for arranging this forum. And thank you to all the attendees for taking time out of your day to share in this very important conversation, because unfortunately, there's no doubt that elder abuse as a crime is escalating dramatically and around North America and across the globe. And I've been privileged, as you mentioned, that I spent actually 22 years of my 25-year career at the DA's office prosecuting just one type of crime, and that was crimes committed against actually two types of victims, older adults aged 65 or older, and dependent adults aged 18 through 64 with physical or mental disabilities. You asked about dynamics, and there's a lot of them. Let me just give you a brief overview first before I venture into dynamics of what the crime of elder abuse really consists of. And for the majority of you are tuning in from California, the penal code section that defines this crime is three numbers, 368. Why do I give you that? Because if you've ever talked to you know that cops never use words, they only use numbers. And the numbers they use are translated to the crime that they are discussing or responding to. So they never talk about a murder, they only talk about a 187, which is the code section for homicide. And why should I give you the code section for elder abuse? It's because if you ever need to be in a position where you have to report a suspected crime to law enforcement, it gives you instant credibility with the dispatcher, with the police officer, because they realize this person knows what they're talking about. So the crime under Penal Code Section 368 covers an umbrella of different activity. It covers physical abuse. It covers mental infliction of emotional abuse. It covers false imprisonment. It covers neglect by a caregiver. And it also covers a wide variety of what we call financial exploitation of elders or dependent adults. And the dynamics that I literally had to learn on the job, are intriguing, because unfortunately the major problem in this whole scenario is that the majority of victims are reluctant to admit that they are victims, or they are unaware that they're victims, or they are too embarrassed or too afraid to come forward and be identified as victims. So the biggest challenge that I faced for 22 years as a prosecutor was, how do I help break through this barrier of invisibility that occurs in so many of these crimes which are being committed against older adults? And that's why a forum like today is so important, because I want to reach out to every single participant today and ask you this question, because I imagine that every single participant has at least one member of their extended family who qualifies as an older adult, 65 or older, or as a dependent adult. And the question I have for each of us is, today, do you know for certain that this person that you're thinking about now within your extended family is not already a victim of some type of elder abuse that I've described? And the problem is that many of us don't know. And particularly in this current crisis, and we'll get to that probably in another question about the impact of coronavirus, many of us don't even know what our day-to-day activities of older adults are. We don't even know whether they're being defrauded or they're being befriended by a suspect. And so that's one of the key dynamics, is how do we break through this invisibility? How do we break through the barrier of silence that often rears its ugly head? Because when I first started prosecuting these crimes, and that was the irony, there were no cases that were being brought to my office by law enforcement. I had to go out and look for the cases. I had to go out basically and shake the trees in the county of San Diego, not literally, but metaphorically. And I had to talk to law enforcement about the dynamics, and also talk to them about the misconceptions that law enforcement often falls into regarding the victims of elder abuse. One of the biggest misconceptions that I kept fighting against was, well, Greenwood, you don't really want to deal with this case. Why not? Well, look at the victim. She's 96. Well, what about that? Well, because she's 96, therefore she's going to be a very unreliable witness in the courtroom. And so I had to keep fighting against that kind of misconception, because invariably in most of the cases that I prosecuted in front of a jury or in front of a judge, every single victim came forward with flying colors and made such a great impression on jurors and on the judge. So that was one of the biggest misconceptions that I had to try to redress, was making sure that we got rid of that kind of approach.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. And I agree. I feel like even when we talk about this type of abuse, we don't normally know too much regardless. I think when we had you come in, we're like, this is something that we need to continue focusing on. It's almost a population that, again, you kind of just, a lot of people definitely disregard or dismiss. So can you share with us some of the common red flags or warning signs that friends, relatives, or other community members can be aware of to see if this is happening to someone that they're connected with?
Yes, and this is important, that we should all keep a lookout, not only for our own elderly relatives, but also for the neighbor across the street, or for the person that we meet on a regular basis, maybe at our place of worship or in a social setting. Unfortunately, of course, in these days, we're not having those social settings as much, but we still live near or next door to elderly people, and we need to keep a lookout. So one of the things I always talk about is any different abrupt change in routine. That is a red flag. One obvious example I have is a colleague of mine who was a former prosecutor. He was astonished to find that his own elderly mother had become the victim of the grandma scam, which is where the suspect contacts an elderly person, convinces them that their grandchild is in jail in a foreign country and needs bail money to get the person out of jail. She changed all her routines and drove all over the county at night, which she never did normally. And my friend was finding this out, that she was changing her routine, but didn't press her on it. It happened around Christmas time, and so she was using an excuse. Well, I'm just going out doing Christmas shopping. But change of routine is a big red flag factor. Another one is any sort of loose conversation that the elderly person has with you. Oh, guess what? My grandniece, who I've not seen for 35 years, has suddenly shown up. Huge red flag. Or you look across the street and you see somebody working on your elderly neighbor's roof or on their driveway or doing some painting. That in itself should make you inquisitive enough. And I know I've had people say, well, it's none of my business. It's all of our business. And there is a difference between being nosy and being inquisitive and responsible as a fellow citizen. And another red flag of observation is when you see an older person change their appearance. Maybe they're losing weight. Maybe they're being a little disheveled. Maybe you're seeing a decline in their mental cognitive ability to remember things. For example, though, somebody who approaches you, who you've known for a long time, and they're asking to borrow money. That is a huge red flag in itself, because it may therefore be an indicator that they have already been scammed, they're overdrawn, and they're too embarrassed to tell anybody, but they do need money in order to pay for their regular bills that are coming in every month. So these are all facts that we all need to be aware of. Also, it's important, not only just us, but for example, employees, a bank or a credit union should become more aware of these telltale signs. I just want to give you one example. It actually happened to my neighbor right across the street from where I'm speaking to you from. She's 89. I had just finished a webinar 4 weeks ago, and she called me, and I could tell she was upset. And I went across, sat in her living room, and she told me that she had just returned from her bank and had withdrawn $23,000 in cash. She was about to drive over a supermarket and buy $23,000 worth of gift cards. But before she did, she decided she better check with me to make sure that this was the appropriate action to take. It was clear, having to her, that she was a victim of a scam. In fact, it was the scam where the crooks actually come and hijack your computer by telling you you've got a virus, and they take control of your computer. And they were trying to buy gift cards and then give them the numbers to the gift cards. I was able to take my neighbor back to the bank, redeposit the $23,000, but I used that opportunity to sit down with the bank tellers and express my dismay at the fact that they had picked up on this red flag. Why was it a red flag? My neighbor had never in her 89 years ever withdrawn $23,000 in cash. They should have known that. Secondly, what on earth are you doing as a bank teller giving an 89-year-old person in broad daylight $23,000 in cash to take in her purse out into the street? That should never happen. They should take more precautions. And had they taken her into a private room and sat her down and asked her very specific questions, they would have discovered very quickly that she was a victim of a scam. So we all need to be educated in this area, not just as community members, but as professionals and as mandated reporters.
Great, thank you so much. And I appreciate you saying that part too. Sometimes it may seem that these red flags are pretty obvious, but unless you really take the time to know what they are or what they look like, you might completely dismiss something. And you can see in various fields and professional places. So I know you mentioned quite a few red flags already. What are the different ways that people would cause this harm? So what are some of the common types that seniors may experience, types of abuse?
Well, I tell you what, in all the 22 years of my prosecuting these cases, the #1 physical abuse case of an elder is the following. The victim is typically a widow in her late 70s, mid 80s, something like that age group. And the perpetrator is her own son, who is living at home with his widowed mother. Now, that son can be one of three types of sons. He's either single, and he's never, ever left home in his life. He has always been in the house, and he has taken advantage of his mother's generosity. The second type of son is the son who was divorced. He'd obviously lived away, got divorced, has now got into financial difficulty and comes back home. The third type of son is the son who's just got released from prison or jail, and the only place he has to go is to his elderly mother's residence. Now, in almost every single case that I prosecuted of these sons, they were almost always lazy, unemployed. And the question I would always have for the victim was, I see that your 47-year-old son is living at home with you. Why is he not working? And the answer would typically always be the same. Well, Mr. Greenwood, he tells me he has a medical condition. And I say, let me guess, he's got a bad back. And she says, how did you know? I said, it comes from sitting on your sofa 8 hours a day playing video games like Fortnite. And I know I'm being a little cynical here, but it's true because I have prosecuted so many of these sons. Now, that also the other common denominator is that these sons have a common addiction, one of three types: either drugs, typically methamphetamine, alcohol, typically vodka and or beer, or thirdly, gambling. And you take those addictions, and because they're unemployed, because they're lazy, how do they get their money to feed their addiction? Simple. They steal from their mother, and the first item they steal is her jewelry. So they take it to the pawn shop and they get cash to feed their addiction. The second item is the debit card. They steal it from the wallet, they take it to the ATM because the mother's got the PIN number written in her wallet, and they can get the access to the cash. Now, when mother finds out that her jewelry is missing or that her debit card is being used, she confronts her son. You know what he does? He gets angry with her. He doesn't deal well with confrontation, and bam, he pops her in the face, smashes her eyeball. He pushes her to the ground. She breaks her hip. And sometimes it leads to deadly consequences. Unfortunately, I have prosecuted too many homicides in which the son murdered his own mother in San Diego County. And why it's so important for people within a family to report any suspected case of physical abuse or even financial abuse is because otherwise, if it goes unreported and uninvestigated, it will escalate to the next degree. So you might end up with a push or a slap, but then it will escalate to a punch in the face or to a bigger push where she breaks a bone, or ultimately, tragically, to a homicide. So that is a real big issue for me, is the family violence cases. And it's surprising how few people appreciate and understand how much family violence goes on between younger members of the family and the older survivor. And it's not just sons, of course. I've prosecuted daughters, I've prosecuted nieces, nephews, grandsons, but they are always living at home, mooching off elderly mother.
Now, we know that, obviously our senior population is at very high risk during COVID. And so we're wondering, has there been an increase in some of these risk factors? And how is that looking right now for our aging population?
Well, there's a number of risk factors that have come with the pandemic. And as a result, I think even though the numbers aren't yet there coming in as quickly as I would hope them to be, because obviously a lot of mandated reporters, such as Adult Protective Services, who typically respond to reports of suspected elder abuse, many of them are still working remotely, and they're not actually able to get out in the field and meet with the intended victims face to face. So some of the risk factors are because of what we call just typical isolation. Since what I call lockdown in mid-March, at least in California and around the world, a lot more older adults are fearful of leaving their home. We're all being, I'm 68, I'm being told that anybody over the age of 65 is at greater risk. And so even I have been a little more cautious about venturing out with my wife to different places. We avoid social gatherings. We avoid any places where we could meet a lot of people. We go in and out of stores very quickly with our masks on. But a lot of people in their 70s and 80s don't even do that. They are very fearful of leaving their home. And if they are being targeted by a family member, or being ripped off, or being targeted on the phone or the internet, they're very reluctant to even admit this on the phone to police or anyone else. They're fearful of leaving the house to go and testify in a court if that even if that becomes possible. So there's a lot of side issues here that the pandemic has caused. And one of the biggest ones is that now the telephone is becoming the lifeline for so many older adults. And who's using the telephone? The crooks. We're all being bombarded with scam calls. Anyone who's got a cell phone knows that. But seniors are particularly vulnerable to receiving all these scam calls. And some of the crooks are using the actual pandemic itself to be the platform for the scam. For example, we're all hearing now about contact tracers, right? So there is legitimate calls being made every day to people by a tracer who is telling the person on the other end of the phone, you may have come into contact with this person who is now tested positive for COVID-19. Well, the scammers know about this, and so they are calling, masquerading as a contact tracer and using that misidentity to gain information about the elderly person. So for so many reasons, isolation, fear about reaching out to other people, the fact that mandated reporters are restricted in what they can do to follow up on suspected cases of elder abuse. And then the final thing I'd like to mention is that within the criminal justice system itself is having an impact through the pandemic on elder abuse victims. I was just speaking to my colleagues at the San Diego DA's office. In many cases, if a defendant is arrested, like this week, for alleged elder abuse case, they may well be released on their own reconnaissance because the jails are overcrowded and there's a problem with the pandemic there. They may never come back to court for 6 more months. And within 6 months, the victim may die, or the victim may, their memory may become more impaired, which may make it more difficult for the prosecution to go ahead. So there's a whole triggering of different results from this pandemic, which we need to be aware of and address.
Thank you so much. I know I hadn't really even thought about the fact that people could take advantage of the contact tracing and then use that to further instill fear or get even more information on folks too. Can you share with us, and you mentioned folks being alone, and so I'm assuming that could be a reason as to how someone might be even more vulnerable. Are there any other I guess characteristics of someone's, the way they live, that could make them another vulnerable person for this?
Sure. Other sort of what I call susceptibility factors. One of them is just the generational thing. Victims in their 80s and 90s, I call them the Second World War II survivors. And just on a side note, people have asked me all the time, why did you spend 22 years of your career prosecuting just one type of crime? And I said, it's very easy. In fact, there are 2 reasons why I did that. And those two reasons are my own mother and father. Sadly, I just lost my mother in November, age 96. I lost my father 5 years ago, age 92, to advanced Alzheimer's. But they were both World War II generation. They were both survivors of the war. In fact, my dad was shot down over the Adriatic on his Styx mission. Thankfully, was rescued by fishermen, and then he went up for another 79 missions. So he was a true hero in my book. And so for a long, long time, I have the deepest respect for people of their generation. But what I did detect from that generation, from the World War II survivors, is that there is an inbuilt respect and trust for somebody's word. And so many of my victims are of an age where if somebody else comes into their life and promises them things without a written contract or over the phone sounds really nice and reassuring, they will immediately trust that person. So there's that cultural age thing that if you're of a certain age group, you were taught when you were younger to trust people, take them at their word. Another susceptibility factor is when you've just lost a lifetime partner. You are very vulnerable to so many emotions, to being the victim of a scam or the victim of some other kind of abuse. I know that the sons that I talked about would be living at home, the father would die, he would then, quote, assume the role of the father figure, but then try to be the bully towards the mother. So many of my victims were, I would say 80% were the surviving mother. And when she loses her lifetime partner, she may have relied upon him. And again, this is an age thing. Typically of that World War II generation, who did the checks, who did the bill paying, who did that, those kinds of things. It typically was the husband. And I'm not being sexist here, but it's just the reality of, I know growing up with my own parents, seeing that and seeing it for myself as a prosecutor. So when the husband dies, the father figure dies, the mother is left more vulnerable to decision-making from her own son or family member or from an outside source coming in and trying to befriend them and then taking full advantage. The number of times where the victim would tell me, but Mr. Greenwood, I trusted her, I trusted him. They sounded so credible. They sounded so sincere. I had no reason to think that they were after my money. I thought they wanted to help me and I was willing to accept their help. And so, you know, these, I call them predators. They are good at finding this kind of susceptible victim. How do they find them? Obviously, if it's a family member, that's pretty easy. But if they're an outsider, how do they find them? Through the obituary column, for example. I always tell people, be careful about putting too many details in a newspaper about your father that has just passed on. Don't put in the names of the surviving wife or children, because otherwise you are going to get people either knocking on your mum's door or calling her up, pretending to be a long lost friend of the late father, and then ingratiating themselves into the life of the victim. Another type of situation that I'm seeing right now is where the victim has lost a partner or has gone through a divorce. They are lonely, so that makes them susceptible. So they're looking for companionship. Now, in COVID-19, they're not in a position to go out, socialize and meet somebody. So what do? They go onto the dating websites and they look for a new friend. Well, guess who's on those dating websites? The predators. And invariably, these predators join match.com or plentyoffish.com or some other dating website, and they steal a real person's identity, including their photo, and they use that to hook the unsuspecting victim. Of course, they'll never meet them, and they'll never go on Zoom because they've already sent a photo, so they'll never reveal their true identity on a camera. And just before they are teasing the victim that they're going to meet up with the victim, oh, something terrible happens to them where they need money. And that's how they get their money. You know, I was just on a call this morning. A 79-year-old man from Florida fell for it and has just transferred $56,000 to what he thought was a female that he was in a so-called virtual relationship with through a dating website, that she needed money for her antique business, that she was buying overseas objects which would help plenish her antique business. He was happy to send her the money. Well, guess what? That female turned out to be a male living in another state, and that's how it happens every single day.
Can you share with us some of the resources then that are available for folks?
Well, you know, when I started 22 years ago prosecuting these cases, or 24 years ago, there were very few resources. Today, we have an abundance of resources, particularly online. And I want to especially mention a few of them that you can go on and Google and download information and pass it on and share it. First of all, there is a wonderful entity called the National Center on Elder Abuse, NCEA, the National Center on Elder Abuse. They are geographically located on the campus of the University of Southern California, up on their Pasadena campus. And they have a brilliant website full of information, videos, documents, how to do things, red flag toolkits. I mean, you name it, they pretty much have it. And if they don't have it, they'll let you know where to find it. And if you want to encourage your local law enforcement agency to become more educated about investigating elder abuse, the National Center on Elder Abuse has a phenomenal resource within its website called EAGLE. EAGLE stands for Elder Abuse Guide for Law Enforcement, EAGLE. And I can't endorse that too highly. That is a phenomenal resource. It covers every single state in the United States. There's a drop-down menu. It's very user-friendly. And so, for example, you may have an elderly relative in the state of North Dakota, but you're not sure about what the law is there. Go to EAGLE, drop-down menu, North Dakota, and it will give you the code section for elder abuse statute in North Dakota. So, terrific resource there. Another one is the Federal Trade Commission. They have a great website, and it's very current. It deals with a lot of the current scams that are going on with coronavirus. So that's FTC. There is, on the federal level, the Elder Justice Initiative. I'll repeat that, the Elder Justice Initiative. Just Google those three words and it will take you to the Department of Justice website. And that, again, has got a lot of fantastic information. One more, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has its own great website and resources for elder abuse issues. Now, I've given you some ideas online, but what are some of the human resources that you can avail yourself of? And obviously, if you come across a situation which is life-threatening involving an elderly person or a dependent adult, then there's no question. You need to call 911 immediately. But if it's not life-threatening and not an immediate endangerment, then the first response should be to your county adult protective service. Now, again, here's a confession. When I started out 24 years ago, I was given this assignment. I knew nothing about elder abuse. I knew nothing about adult protective services. And I went to them and basically admitted, I said, I'm so sorry. I've heard of child protective services, but I don't know who you are. I do not know what you do. Tell me about yourselves. And I can honestly tell you that in the main, adult protective services do a phenomenal job under limited resources. But if you live in California or any other state, you have a county agency typically called Adult Protective Services, and that should be your first response. And unless you are a mandated reporter, and you should know if you are, then unless you are, you don't have to give your name. You can be anonymous, but you can say, I'm calling about my elderly aunt. I think her son is taking advantage of her. Can you please open up a case and go and investigate? And that's what Adult Protective Services will do. They will make an unannounced visit to the elderly victim, and they will assess for themselves whether or not this is indeed a case that requires what I call a crossover investigation by law enforcement. And if they think that there is indeed grounds for concern, then APS will typically then contact law enforcement and have them do a criminal investigation into the allegations.
Thank you so much. And I've also put those resources that you mentioned on the chat box. So if anyone's interested in getting those, there are the 2 links for the first 2 as well. Thank you. And then if we could discuss, what do prevention strategies look like in the prevention of elder abuse?
Prevention strategies. Well, I think it starts with making ourselves more aware of the dynamics of elder abuse, like we're doing today, to make ourselves more aware of what is the crime, and to make ourselves willing to become more educated by using the resources that we've talked about, and then passing on that information. First of all, passing on that information to our own elderly relatives in a way that is not patronizing, but at the same time is informative, without being scary, but being realistic. Reminding older adults, you know, when you get a phone call, you don't have to answer it. Let it go to message. If it's somebody that knows you and wants to be in touch with you, they will leave a message and a phone number. But if it's a scammer, they'll just move on to the next intended victim. So things like that. For example, also, if you know that your elderly relative has an unlocked mailbox and that they are housebound, and that their way of getting letters into the mail is by putting it in the mailbox unlocked with a red flag up, you need to get involved and change that whole system. Because right now, I can guarantee you that somewhere in my county, there is a crook driving around stealing things out of mailboxes, either because of the red flag was up or because the mail carrier has just been and put the mail inside the unlocked mailbox. Let's think about installing video cameras into our elderly relatives' homes, just to give them a little bit more of a security system. Let's do our own part in training banks and credit unions what to look for, how to become more aware of the latest scams. So there's a lot we can all do, and the worst thing we can do is to say, it's none of my business, you know, that's for the cops, that's for prosecutors. No, it's all of us. Together as a community, we've got to get more involved.
Thank you. And it really is just that, right? Just spreading that education to anyone, that because we can all benefit from it. And so how can we structure, either as community members or as agencies, how can we structure our programs and services to meet the needs of the aging population?
I think that's very relevant. You know, until a few years ago, there was very little that a lot of agencies did to care for the elderly There was a real primary focus on young children and on victims of domestic violence. And I applaud that. But at the same time, we need to take the lessons that we've learned from providing resources for young children and for victims of DV and apply them to older adults. We need to find out in so many different ways what the needs of elderly victims are when they are victims of some forms of abuse. Sometimes it literally is separating them immediately from the person that is causing the violence or the torment. It is sometimes trying to stop the financial damage immediately. It is sometimes making sure that the older adult has the necessary caregiving resources. Because sometimes if we arrest the perpetrator, that perpetrator may actually have been fulfilling a caregiving role. So we need to be able to get in place enough plans ahead of time to provide an alternative caregiving plan for this older adult. So a lot of it is being aware of the red flags and trying to anticipate ahead of time what this victim may need. They may need, for example, pro bono elder law attorney who could help them, at least in the initial stages, by offering free of charge to help them with certain things. Maybe they need to have documents amended because they've included the suspect in so many documents, and that suspect has to be taken out. So again, they may need legal assistance on a civil matter as well as working on the criminal side for police and prosecutors.
Thank you. And how can we work cohesively as community-based agencies to support educating or assisting our judicial system? I know you kind of mentioned a little bit on that, but what are some different changes in policies and how can we get involved?
Well, I think it's, and I would like to extend it not just to judicial policies, but also to, I want to say political purposes, in the sense of we have got to get the attention of our legislature and convince them that elder abuse is not going away, it's escalating, it's getting worse. And one statistic which I think we should all be telling our legislature is this one: by the year 2035, there'll be more people in the United States of America over the age of 65 than children under the age of 18. As a result, therefore, we should be planning now for the avalanche of suspected cases that will be coming in the next 10 to 15 years. If you compare the number of child protective service workers to adult protective service workers in any county, the ratio is typically 5 to 1, even worse, 10 to 1. That is ridiculous. We've got to put adult protective services on the same footing as child protective services with funding. So that's one thing. Another thing I'm big on is establishing in every community in North America what I call an MDT, a multidisciplinary team approach for elder abuse issues. And unfortunately, there's still a lack of these MDTs. We have them all over the place for domestic violence. We have them for child abuse cases, but not too many jurisdictions have an elder abuse multidisciplinary team. And we all can be part of that MDT. It's not just APS. It's not just prosecutors and cops. It involves hairdressers, mail carriers. It involves professional conservators or guardians, as we like to call them. It includes all kinds of people that get involved in the lives of older adults and make them part of the team. Bank tellers, nurses, doctors, mental health counselors, financial investor advisors, they all see different aspects of exploitation of older adults. And when we bring them together in a multidisciplinary, confidential environment, it's amazing the impact that a team like that can have on the broader community. So that's what I would encourage your participants to become excited about, is become plugged in to an MDT.
Thank you so much. And we have some questions coming in. I had one
Good.
that asked, is there a decrease in abuse or violence against an elderly person who does not report that they're being abused?
So the question is there a decrease?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, no. To the contrary, I have found that if the incident is not reported, ultimately the conduct gets worse. And I base that, unfortunately, on a number of homicides that I've prosecuted over my 25-year career. Because in almost every single homicide of an older adult, I can trace back through interviewing family members that prior to the homicide, there were unreported and uninvestigated other incidents. And when I would ask the family members, well, why didn't anybody say something? This is typically the response. Well, Mr. Greenwood, mother, it's typically the mother who's the victim of the homicide, mother didn't want us to. Mother thought that she could handle this on her own. Mother said that by calling the police, it would bring shame on the family, and we didn't want to do that. We respected mother's wishes. We didn't want to go against her. So I'm of the view, based upon, unfortunately, my life's experiences, that by staying silent is the worst thing we can do. Even if the victim implores us, don't say anything. If we truly believe that our mother or our relative or our next door neighbor is being exploited, sexually assaulted, physically harmed, or whatever it is, we need to do something about that.
Thank you. And for MDT, some folks are asking for clarification. Was the multidisciplinary approach?
Yes, the multidisciplinary approach is one which I'm sure a lot of advocates of domestic violence clinics are fully aware of. But the multidisciplinary approach is one that we've brought into the elder abuse arena over the last 10 years or so. And it involves primarily agencies from a community signing on to an agreement that they will meet maybe 6, 7, 8 times a year to discuss case reviews, either cases that are already in the system or cases that have yet to be put into the system, to seek the input of all the members as to what should happen, what is the solution, what are some of the practical steps that we need to take here. And in the day of coronavirus, I mean, one of the positives from this pandemic is that we've realized, gosh, we don't need to physically meet to get things done. We can meet just like we're doing now. On the call, we've got 44 participants. I don't know where they're from, but they're from all over. We're all meeting, we're all engaging, and that can be done with a multidisciplinary team. I was just on one this morning with an MDT from Virginia, and they had on the call, they had prosecutors, they had detectives, they had an inspector from the Office of Inspector General for Social Security, they had a doctor, they had a forensic accountant, they had APS, and it was brilliant. They were all discussing various scenarios that had come to their attention. And we have to remember that these cases don't always end up at the police because of victim reluctance or victim embarrassment. And so when we get more people coming together in an MDT environment, the more intelligence we can gather and the more effective we can become in combating this crime.
Thank you. Oftentimes we get asked, well, is this abuse or is that abuse? Is there a way to be able to, I guess, answer some of those questions? For instance, we had someone that asked, what about the older parents who just simply squandered their money, and because you don't have the means to just give them money, is that considered abuse if you don't? So is there a way to answer some questions that some folks might be having in that way?
That is a great question. And also the example is a good one, because I know some children, adult children, are put into a difficult position. You know, how far is there an obligation to care for an aging parent who has squandered their finances? Is there going to be somebody who's going to be coming along, knocking on the door saying, you've neglected your elderly parent, you're going to be arrested? This is why we need prosecutors to be fully trained in every state as to what the crime of elder abuse consists of. I can tell you, in 22 years of prosecuting cases, I never once prosecuted an adult child for not providing money to an elderly parent who had squandered it. But I did prosecute children who were living at home who neglected to take their elderly parent to the doctor, or neglected to deal with a decubitus ulcer, pressure sore that was developing on a bedridden parent because they couldn't be bothered to turn them or treat them. But here's also an interesting dynamic that I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about. What is considered abuse in the criminal area can only really be best answered by a trained prosecutor and not by a police officer. Here's one of the problems. There's an allegation of financial exploitation of an older adult. It's basically theft, right? The person will call up the police, and the police listen to this person talking about this allegation of theft. And the response of the police officer is this: you know what, I hear you, but that's not theft. That's a civil matter. You need to go find a lawyer. Now, whenever I hear that being said, I immediately kind of jump into it and I say, excuse me, officer, forgive me, but you are giving a legal opinion, and you are not qualified to give a legal opinion whether something is civil or something is criminal in nature. That can only be done by a trained prosecutor. So, officer, you take an initial report and then you send it over to the prosecutor's office and let a trained prosecutor determine if this is a crime or if it's a civil matter. You talk to any adult protective service worker in this country, and then one of the number one frustrations that they will tell you is that my referrals are never followed up on of financial exploitation because I'm being told by the police it's just a civil matter. So that is one of the problems that we have got to address, and we can address that in a multidisciplinary team environment.
Yeah, that is a great point. And that's why we need that constant communication, right, with various fields. Someone asked, and I don't know if the answer is on the resources that you previously provided. Someone asked, is there a website that I can refer my aging parents to that will inform them of how to recognize scammers or abusive individuals? Great.
Actually, there is another website which I neglected to tell you about, and I'm embarrassed I didn't. AARP Fraud Watch. AARP, even if you're not a member, it doesn't matter. They have a fantastic website which talks about the various scams and how to recognize them. So it is called AARP Fraud Watch. And just go to that and you will be able to download lots of different information regarding the hottest scams out there right now and how to recognize when they are scams. So it talks about the call supposedly coming in from the Social Security Administration or from the IRS or from the grandma scam, or congratulations, you've just won $1 million from the sweepstakes, or the romance scam, you know, and so forth. So that is really an excellent question. And we do all need to pass on that information to our aging parents.
Thank you so much. Now, is there any last words that you'd like to leave us with as we're wrapping this up? I really appreciate your time and everyone's participation in this.
Well, again, I want to thank Laura's House for what you believe in, what you stand for. I've been fortunate enough to also be part of your training for your students, and I really look forward to that every year. But I want to say to your participants that if they are struggling with a scenario, either now or in the future, involving an elderly person in their community and they don't know which way to turn, I am more than happy for you. And if you, I'm so impressed with how you can type all this and still listen to me. This is very good. But if you can type in my email address into the chat room, okay? So it's pgreen.dda. So that's PGREEN for November, DDA, Delta Delta Alpha, at gmail.com. So pgreen.dda@gmail.com. Please feel free to email me. And even if I don't know the answer, I hopefully can put you in touch with somebody who can give you that kind of answer. But I just want to hopefully energize people into believing that this problem is going to become massive, if not already, in the next 10 years because of demographics, because of the fact that so many people in this country today have Alzheimer's disease, which is only one form of dementia. They tell us there's over 24 types of dementia. And so you can see for all those reasons that it's going to become more of a problem. The fact that victims are too embarrassed to report, it puts the burden more on us to be looking for those red flags and to be more proactive. And with the resources that we can avail ourselves of, with the fact that we can join a multidisciplinary team, I'm hoping also to convince enough people to go to law school and become prosecutors to join the fight in combating elder abuse. Because I have to tell you, in all my 40 years as a lawyer, nothing has given me greater satisfaction than going into court and fighting for justice for an older victim. And it's so sad when victims of a certain age are not expecting people to fight for them. You know, they almost expect, well, I'm 95, who's going to be caring about me? Yes, we need to be so focused on seeking justice for a 95-year-old as much as we do for a 25-year-old or a 5-year-old. Their lives are as important, and they are treasures that we need to honor and respect.
Thank you so much, Paul. We appreciate your continued advocacy and your partnership with our agency. And I'm looking at the chat and everyone loves you. They think you did an amazing job, as you always do. So we're all really appreciative for all this valuable information. But thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you all stay safe and take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody.